Okay, let's start. I'm with Gabriel Makin. He's a researcher and an analyst at the Social Research Foundation. Gabriel and I, you remember, we spoke last February in London when I was there. I was attending the ACK conference, and of course, both Gabriel and I were there at that beautiful, great conference, the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship Conference. It really was a great time. I learned a lot, and we did speak about that here on this show. Gabriel, how are you, sir? Wonderful to see you. How are you doing?
Great to see you again, Phumlani. I'm doing very well.
Yeah. I'm just stunned, astonished. I'm jealous of your capabilities of, being where you are in the UK and then being able to keep on working on South Africa, understanding what's going on in politics, being engaged. It's quite a skill, eh? And you've been doing great work. You've done great work lately on the Kill the Boer survey. Well, I would say the patterns of or the perceptions on free speech in South Africa, and you did some survey around the Kill the Boer song or the chant that is popular amongst the EFF supporters or the EFF party, the Economic Freedom Fighters, led by Mr. Julius Malema. It's interesting that that's what you found, just one number to open our conversation. 83% of EFF people, voters, they say the song is either hate speech or it's irresponsible to sing it or to go around chanting the chant. Tell us about that.
Yes, so as you rightly said, the latest survey done by the Social Research Foundation was focused in on the question of kill the Boer and freedom of speech in South Africa more broadly. And as you pointed out, now 83% of EFF voters say or oppose the singing of the Kill the Boer. Either they think it's hate speech or they think it's irresponsible to sing in South Africa today. And while that may seem kind of shocking and crazy to those of us who haven't paid attention to the kind of public opinion of EFF voters, what this is really an indication of is the fact that the EFF does not draw its support from the policy agenda or from the stunts necessarily that its leaders try to pull or that its leaders or the agenda its leaders are pushing. Instead, the EFF should be understood mainly as a incredibly successful marketing campaign. It's something we touched on in our last discussion, but that red beret that people don that gives them a sense of belonging that's the thing that draws people to the EFF. And so it shouldn't be surprising to anyone who is versed in South African public opinion data that although the EFF leadership is adamant about its right to sing "Kill the Boer" and about the importance of that song, um, really the average EFF voter thinks that it's rather distasteful for that song to be sung. They're focused more on, the basic improvement of their material circumstances. And so I think it's a fascinating insight into the South African public because oftentimes our political leaders are so far removed from the beliefs of their voter bases, and this is yet another reflection of that.
Mm-mm. Um, it's a contradiction because you look at their rallies, Gabriel. Their rallies, they sing this song, their president defends it, and no one comes out to say this is not what we stand for. So explain to us these differences. How is it that when we see these guys in their rallies, in their events, they are singing this, they are chanting this chant? What's going on here? Why the differences between what we see right in public, and as soon as you do the survey, you find out something that is different. Explain that difference, for the audience.
Uh, it's not it's a paradox as you point out, but it's not a paradox that's isolated only to the EFF. So to use a more concrete example, one of the things that we've done as the Social Research Foundation is track different people's policy preferences. And one of the most interesting findings that come out of our track of policy preferences is that ANC voters are oftentimes incredibly opposed to ANC policy positions. So why is the ANC voter base being opposed to the ANC policy positions relevant? Well, it's the same thing that carries through with the EFF voter base and the EFF's policy positions. Oftentimes, the will of the voter is completely disregarded by the politicians for whatever reason, be it ideological, be it structural, maybe this is the leadership has decided that this is the policy agenda of the party, and no single person can change that. Or it's just, a kind of it could even be a reflection of the fact that these leaders aren't engaging with their voter bases. They are engaging with are the activists amongst the party who they see as a representation of the broader voter base, but actually those activists who go out and do campaign work, door knocking, and whatever are the most committed minority of the party. And so, it turns out that in fact, for most political parties, a lot of the time, they are engaged in talks around policy positions and policy agendas that are so far removed from the desires of their voter base. And it should, and that fact also played out in some of the results that we saw in the last election. We had the ANC lose 17%. That was the biggest shocker coming out of 2024. But the EFF did not improve its position going into the last election. And so obviously the EFF wasn't pursuing an agenda or a campaign that was jiving with more voters. It actually reduced their share somewhat. And so this is a trend that isn't isolated to any single party, but is an overall issue within the South African political class, that they tend not to be focusing on the bread and butter issues that the South African voters actually care about. And instead, they're more concerned with political performance and the theater of politics, trying to show that we are committed to our cause. And in so doing, we have to pull these stunts like, filling a stadium and singing a terrible chant, for example.
Yeah. And we are saying that the MK party, you are noticing same sort of kind of data,
Yes,
right? Yeah.
in fact, one of the fun things that I've noticed since the MK party has become a demographic that we look at in our data is that if I were to start a political party and let's say, choose a voter base to have based on the average beliefs of the voter bases, I would actually want the MK party voter base to be my voter base because in fact the MK party voter base on most positions in South Africa are the most moderate, most principled, and most conservative. It's an astounding thing that, and again, it speaks to the fact that South African politics isn't really about the policy positions of any political party, but it's a lot to do with the theater and the sense of a belonging that a political party can create once you have become a member, once you've decided to make the step into that party. And so the MK party, very much like the EFF, is actually filled with moderate, very civil, very well-meaning South Africans who haven't necessarily read the manifesto and don't necessarily understand the policy positions of the party that they've voted
You
for.
see, Gabriel, that's where the problem is, in my observation. And that's bad for our society, right? Because, okay, here are sensible voters, as you describe them, right? They are sensible, they are largely conservative, they want to own their homes, their private property, their own businesses, they want a job, they don't want welfare, and so on and so on and so on, right? Yet, when it comes to voting, they continue voting for the parties because just because the EFF, sorry, just because the voters of the EFF, they are saying that they are against or they disapprove of the kill the Boer trend. Just because they are saying that, it doesn't mean that the EFF isn't will not implement policies that sort of are racially divisive. They promote promoting things like land grabs, as they've been doing for a while, things like huge state interventions. So you also spoke about the ANC voters. Yes, the ANC voters, they are against the ANC policies, as you said, policy programs. Yet they continue voting for them. And the ANC is implementing not what their voters want, but something totally in the opposite direction, right? So for me, I understand that the voters, they are sensible people, as you describe them. My issue is that if they vote for the NC for whatever reasons, clearly, because then it's not about policy, there's a problem with that because the NC is continuing to implement basically the programs that are against the wishes of their followers, right? Or against the interests of their followers. So I'm not sure how do we resolve this, because I don't want us to come to a sort of a view that, well, things are fine in the country. I think for me that is a big problem, where we have politicians who continuously being voted into power, and doing things that are clearly, as your survey shows, against the interests of the voters. But if the MK party were to, you've just described the MK party voters as to these are reasonable people. They want what is best for them and for the country. They don't like racial divisions, right? But I mean, if the MK party comes into power, they will continue implementing their programs that will go against the wishes of their voters and the country in general. How do we deal with this, in your view?
Well, I think part
How
of the
do we
problem
create
is just,
this? Because I would like us, Gabriel, to get to a point where, as a voter, yes, your interest, you stand for certain things, but how you vote also reflects, on your values. You vote according to your values. How do we get there, sir?
so I think part of the problem that's led us to this point is that South Africa's democracy is very new, and so it's taken a while for the kind of principles of democracy, that your vote matters and that your vote will be translated into a policy agenda, that hasn't necessarily filtered into voters' minds as much as we would like, as we've been describing. But what's interesting now is that I think that the 2024 election will go down in South African history as a turning point and as a psychological watershed moment. And why I say that is that the Social Research Foundation, when we talked in February, we talked about how the ANC on our numbers was polling at 32%. But that was the kind of first of the surveys that happened this year. And now we've had the IRR and Brenthurst, who, although getting what seem to be wildly contradictory numbers, are demonstrating through their research that South African voters are starting to wake up to the fact that their vote matters and that their vote will define the policy agenda of the next government. And so I think while that hadn't necessarily set in for amongst most of the registered voters in the lead up to 2024, which is why the ANC still commanded, a massive 40%, the biggest single share of any party, 40.18%, I think is the precise total. What it means now is that voters have watched them form a coalition, legitimize all of the parties inside of the coalition as, partners, people we can work with. And now what we're seeing is that the ANC and the DA's polls have moved very close together. The DA seems to be assaulting the 30% number but going up from 20 to 30%. They seem to be assaulting it upwards, and the DA and the ANC seem to be assaulting the 30% number downwards. And so I think we will have to wait for the next national election for this truly to filter into the body politic. But what seems to be happening is that as you talk about this issue that voters aren't necessarily voting for the policy position that they want to get out of a government, but for a sense of loyalty or whatever it is that's motivating a sense of belonging, whatever the motivation is. I think that is starting to shift away, and we're starting to move into a place in which a large enough voters realize that the party they vote for defines the government they get, and that by choosing a party outside of the ANC, they are going to choose a non-ANC government. And so while we will have to go through 4 years of the government still being dominated by the ANC's policy agenda, which I doubt will shift very much away from the kind of ideological road that it has previously taken up till now. I think that what you'll find is that the result of this will have been that finally voters en masse will actually get to the point because circumstances will have forced them to the point where they realize that they have to make rational decisions with their vote, and they have to do it on the basis of what the politicians are saying they will do with the power.
Mm-mm. My view, Gabriel, is this, right? My view is that we have to see the vote moving away from the leftist parties to liberal, classical liberal parties, right? Or parties that are center right. Who am I talking about when I say that? Let's be honest and direct here. I'm talking about the DA. I'm talking about the Freedom Front Plus. You could add IFP to an extent. You could add, ACDP. Remember this thing? What was it called? Just before the election, the coalition
Multi-party charter.
multi-party charter, right? That was more of center, I would say center right, right? In our context, right and center right. I want to see our vote nationally moving toward that. For me, it's not about that the vote moves away from the ANC to other opposition parties, because they could move from the ANC to other far left parties like the EFF, right? As per their policy programs, like the MK party, because they seem to have the same policy programs, in my observation. But and if that's the case, as things have been happening, because when you look at the DA's support over the past 10 years or so, it hasn't really grown that much. Helen Zille was a person back when she was believing the leadership of the party. That's where the party made strides. But over the past in recent years, they haven't been doing well, right? At least at a pace at a rapid pace of growth. Um, so yes, we need to see the voters moving away from this leftist ideas and shifting their votes to the right center sort of politics. That is my view. What do you think of that? Because I'm quite concerned that if you still add up, Gabriel, if you add up all the votes of the ANC, the EFF, the MK party, and so on, what you could call, some people have said, Mike Shem says there's ANC light parties. In other words, these are parties who basically agree with the ANC. It's just that they believe that in policy ideas. It's just that they believe that if it were them, they would do it better.
Yeah.
Implementing the same programs. But I want that shift, because for me, our democracy will be stronger when we see the shift where South Africans are saying we are tired of statism and control that is destroying jobs, leaving our cities and towns collapsed, and we are moving to giving other people with a different set of ideas a chance. And by the way, Gabriel, it doesn't have to be intellectual. They don't have to be intellectually, well versed in terms of left versus right. They just need to recognize that, you know what, these ideas these guys are giving us, they are not working. you know.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what
For
are
sure.
your thoughts on that? I mean, where do you
So
disagree or agree with me on that one? But I do get your point, Gabriel, that let's give it time. That's what you're saying. You're saying that let's see the next election, but you are saying that there is that movement.
yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So I would agree on a macro level. I'm in total agreement. I think that it would be the biggest tragedy would be that if voters started to leave the ANC en masse to move towards the EFF and MK, you wouldn't get any sort of improvement. You wouldn't have South Africa moving in the right direction, and the political class from one government to the next would look very much the same. But I think what is hopeful about what trends are starting to emerge from the data is that it does not look as though the ANC, EFF, MK voter base is growing. It looks as if that is shrinking. So it looks that currently the in our polls and in across every poll that's been done since the last election, EFF and MK's numbers are stable, if not slightly down. And the ANC's number is also now coming down and coming down quite rapidly and falling quite far. And so that's being reflected in a pickup, mainly a pickup in the DA's numbers, and quite in some polls, like the Institute of Race Relations poll, quite a large pickup that puts it beyond the ANC. And so on a macro level, I'm in total agreement that the trick that needs to be pulled by for South Africa, and on a very personal note, of course, I speak now not as a member of the Social Research Foundation, but as Gabriel Makin here. Very important to note that. But the trick that will need to be pulled is that the combined total number percentage of the EFF, MK, ANC, and then the tiny parties that are just, yes men for the ANC that exist in Parliament. I'm talking about Al Jamaa, the PAC, parties of this nature. They as a whole need to drop below 50%. And if they do, then it will mean that there is enough space for a new majority coalition to be built. And that's where a kind of multi-party charter replacement might find itself.
I'm
And
speaking.
so
Yeah, yes.
and so the what we're seeing reflected in some polls is that what the first thing that needs to happen for us to get to that point, though, is that the ANC cannot be the one to make the next government, which means that the ANC needs to be the second biggest party. The DA needs to grow beyond the ANC for this to be for us to even have the opportunity to create this new government. Because if the ANC gets 30% of the vote and the DA gets 29% of the vote in 2029, then the ANC will be the one making the coalition that goes back into the union buildings as opposed to the DA. And so there's no way of escaping the ANC unless the DA can beat them. But then the other thing that needs to happen is that as the DA broadens its tent, you need to make sure that they are allowing kind of the voters on their right flank to go off into the other parties that you point out, the Freedom Front Plus, the ACDP, the IFP to an extent, on a good day, maybe the PA. These parties need to get enough additional support that combined with the DA, they can garner a majority.
Mm.
And so and so why I say you need to give this time is that you need to allow for the trend, the process that the ANC has been putting itself under for the last almost 20 years of its bleeding support, and you need to allow it to continue to bleed support more. And then you need to fortify the opposition parties that we want the support to bleed into, and there needs to be as much advocacy on behalf of not only the DA, but on, as you point out, the center right of South Africa to legitimize all of the parties amongst the voter base.
I'm speaking to Gabriel Makin. He's a researcher, an analyst at the Social Research Foundation. We are speaking about free speech in South Africa, the kill the Boer trend, SA politics. It does seem his survey shows that the majority of EFF supporters they disapprove of the kill the Boer trend. So we are trying to understand how is that. Why are these numbers different from what we see in rallies and so on, and what we hear from EFF leaders? Remember, I'm on X at Phumlani Emma Josie. Remember also to get yourself a copy of my book, Lessons from Past Heroes. I do have copies here in Johannesburg. So if you want a copy at a discount, signed copy, then you can reach out to me. Otherwise, you can order on amazon.co.za, on Take a Lot, or any stores, bookstores across South Africa. So, Gabriel, let's close about the free speech in general, your observations. What do you see what's going on in South Africa, right? Are you comfortable with with where we are in terms of free speech in the country?
So that's quite a loaded question, but I'll try my best to unpack what you've said there.
Yeah.
So as I mentioned in the beginning, this the survey that we did about Kill the Boer was about free speech and Kill the Boer, and I'll give you some of the numbers that made me optimistic, and then I'll move on to the numbers that made me less so. So
Mm,
the mo first number that was make me incredibly optimistic is the first question we asked people: how important is the right to free speech to you personally? And amongst all voters, 93% say it's very or quite important. And this across the board, you break it down by language group, by party affiliation, by income, by race, by whatever demographic. Across the board, there is large scale support for freedom of speech on an individual level. And then and so that's a very, very good thing. People in South Africa believe and think that freedom of speech is important. Then we get to the not so optimistic number, which is we asked this question, which was basically, how would you define freedom of speech? But we gave people two options. The first one, option was everyone has the right to freedom of expression, which includes the choice to cause offense to others. The second option, everyone has the right to freedom of expression, but that does not include causing offense to others. And on that question, now 82% of all voters said picked the second option, the option that does not include the right of causing offense to others. And of course, that's almost nonsensical because you cannot have the right of freedom of speech. The right of freedom of speech is not there to protect the things that you say that are obviously true. I don't have freedom of speech to be able to say the sky is blue, the wall behind me is white, and I'm wearing a tie. These are not defensive things. No one is going to have an issue with it. No one's going to try and stop me from saying these things.
mm,
The reason you have freedom of speech is exactly to protect offensive speech. Because, and this is not an advocation, one shouldn't take this as me advocating everyone should be offensive. I love people being offensive and rude, and that's not what I mean by this, because offensive speech is, by definition, it is a subjective experience. You take offense, you do not give offense.
yeah.
So if I were to say, for example, that the Blue Bulls is a pretty bad rugby team, that would be an example of a number of people a very offensive speech. They would be very angry about what I said. But this is what freedom of speech is there to protect. The opinions you have that get people angry, that get people upset. And so it is a worrying thing that the vast majority of South Africans do not believe that freedom of speech includes the right to cause offense to others, because that is actually what freedom of speech is. But then we have to take it a step further, which is, why would South Africans believe this? And this is where we get to quite a complicated territory, because I don't think it's necessarily a reflective of a authoritarian desire to control what people say and to stop and to make sure that no offensive language can be said in South Africa, and that we all just, say nice things and act in a single way. I don't think that that's what's motivating this. I think that it's much more complicated. You know, one of the things that we've talked about already is that the Social Research Foundation generally believes that the population of South Africa is moderate, somewhat conservative, and is basically concerned with the improvement of their lives. And so the fact that they're moderate, polite, conservative people might mean that they don't like the idea of offensive speech. So it's not so much that they want to control what you say, they just wish, they think, it's unfortunate, and we would rather not have people be offensive in their speech. So it's kind of more, being polite and kind, as opposed to saying, no, no, you shouldn't be allowed to say certain things. And then the other issue that South Africa has with regard to freedom of speech is that in terms of our the tradition of freedom of speech, it's a very new thing and it's very, very messy. There is unequal jurisprudence on different cases in the country. So, depending on the race of a plaintiff, the Constitutional Court has either taken very liberal or very strict definitions of freedom of speech. So, with the most recent finding that kill the Boer constitutes free speech, but a racially sensitive suggestion by a white person was previously found by the Constitutional Court to not be freedom of speech and to fact be hate speech. And so the fact that there is this messy, confusing jurisprudence in the country means that it's probably very difficult for the average South African to even know what freedom of speech in South Africa means. And
Yeah,
so this is a very long-winded answer of way of
yeah,
saying that I think that one should be optimistic because South Africans believe in the idea of freedom of speech, but one should be worried because there has been no attempt to clarify in the country what freedom of speech
what
actually
it is.
means.
Yeah, yeah. Gabriel, wonderful to talk to you, sir. Thank you so much for a great conversation as usual. I hope when I invite you again, you are going to say, yes, we are growing. We are getting close to 3,000 subscribers now. So we'll continue pushing for these conversations to grow our audience on our YouTube channel. You are saying, let's be hopeful, right? That the DA wins in 2029, or not that it wins, but it gets more votes than the ANC. And that let's give things time. That's what we are saying. Um, Great to we'll do that. Let's do that. Let's do what Gabriel is saying. Let's be calm and give things time. So wonderful to talk to you, sir. We'll chat soon, eh?
Thank you so much for having me on, Phumlani. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Wonderful. It's Phumlani Majozi, the author of Lessons from Past Heroes. This is the Phumlani Majozi Show. We'll chat soon.